called a fraud by the bank, until a general stormed in and changed everything. On a chilly October morning in a quiet corner of Vancouver, an elderly man with silver hair and a steady, upright posture stepped through the tall glass doors of Maple Dominion Bank. The door closed gently behind him with a soft click, the kind of sound that marked the end of a long chapter and perhaps the start of another, though he never asked for it. In his hand, he held a worn black cap, the gold embroidery on it faded but still legible. Veteran, Korean, and Vietnam service. The wind nudged the collar of his coat slightly, revealing a crisply ironed white shirt with frayed cuffs, aged by time and repetition. His name was Martin G. Blake, once a colonel in the military, a man whose strategic mind had once shaped operations across continents. But today, he was simply a 78-year-old man with trembling hands, not from fear, but from age, hoping to withdraw a modest amount from an old account to help his grandson with tuition. There were no medals pinned to his chest, no uniform, just a quiet dignity, a folded piece of service history in his breast pocket, and eyes that had seen far more than most would ever understand. He joined the queue like any ordinary customer, standing patiently behind busy younger people glued to their phones, ahead of a woman loudly disputing overdraft charges with a teller. He didn't complain, didn't sigh, just stood calmly, as if a lifetime of waiting had taught him that time, when spent in silence, had its own rhythm. When it was finally his turn, he stepped to the counter and gently offered his ID and a brittle discharge certificate. The teller, a young woman likely in her early 20s, glanced at the documents and then at her screen. Her eyes blinked once, then again, her expression shifting from neutral to hesitant. The account, under the name Martin Blake, hadn't been touched in nearly a decade, and the system had flagged it as dormant. She smiled awkwardly, trying to stay professional but failing to hide her uncertainty. She called her manager. The man who arrived, Ethan Carver, was in his mid-30s, with perfectly styled hair and a blue tie too tight against his smug expression. He approached with the confidence of someone who always assumed he was right. He barely glanced at the paperwork before peering at Martin with eyes full of quiet judgment. "So, this is your account, sir," he said, stretching the word sir like it was a joke. "This discharge paper looks like it was printed in the Stone Age." The young teller laughed nervously, unaware that her laughter echoed against a man who had once shielded wounded comrades beneath mortar fire outside Eastern Nha Trang. Martin said nothing. He slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a coin, bronze-toned, its edges smoothed with time, but still bearing the sharp emblem of an eagle and 5 stars. A bishop coin, the kind of challenge coin awarded only to operatives involved in classified Joint Force Command. Ethan barely looked at it before scoffing. "Nice trinket. You can get those online nowadays." He nodded at the security guard. "I think we've got another fake vet trying to work the system. Escort him out, would you?" The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking back to Martin. He didn't move. Martin gathered the coin with reverent fingers, nodded slightly, and walked to a bench near the front window. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply sat, hands folded over his cane, eyes staring out past the glass at a gently swaying Canadian flag across the street. A strange hush fell over the room. People who had snickered began to quiet. Others looked away. Only one person kept her eyes fixed. Kira Thompson, 32, a former Air Force logistics officer now working in private defense contracting, stood still. She had seen that coin once before. It was in a closed-door meeting when a retired commander had dropped it on a conference table, and every officer in the room had stood without being told. She walked to the counter and stared Ethan in the eyes. "You just made a very serious mistake." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? Who are you?" Kira pointed toward Martin. "That man is no fraud. That coin outranks every paycheck in this building." Ethan smirked. "If he's that important, where's his entourage?" Kira didn't answer. She stepped outside and made a call. But inside the bank, someone else had recognized the name, Martin G. Blake. An older employee who'd worked there for more than 2 decades and didn't hold a fancy title but remembered everything, was now standing in front of a brass plaque in the archival hall. Among its engraved names was one still visible despite the years, Colonel M.G. Blake, Strategic Coordinator, Royal Command, 1973. He had once designed the original supply routes for the military base that once stood on the very ground now occupied by this bank, The man picked up a landline, dialed a number that only a few veterans ever memorized, and spoke 6 words. Bishop Coin. Maple Dominion. He's here. Then he hung up. Martin still sat, unmoving. Not because he was afraid. Not because he was angry. But because he was used to being forgotten. Used to waiting while the world moved on, unsure whether men like him still mattered. He didn't know that a few blocks away, a general was furiously slamming his phone down, throwing on his full dress uniform, and preparing to walk into a room not because he had to, but because he owed his entire command career to the man now quietly sitting by a window, with a coin in his pocket and not a single word of complaint. Under the sterile lighting of Maple Dominion Bank, silence pressed into the room like a slow-building storm. The security guard fidgeted near the entrance, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the old man sitting by the window, still and composed as if carved from stone. Martin Blake hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. His presence was quiet, but inescapably present, like a memory just beneath the surface of everyone's skin. The others in the lobby avoided looking at him directly. Their laughter had died too fast, too awkwardly. No one said a word, except one woman who still stood near the counter, staring, not at her phone, not at her receipt, but at that man. Kira Thompson's throat felt dry, like something had stuck there ever since she'd seen the coin. The Bishop coin. She'd only seen it once before, 5 years ago, in a top-floor defense briefing at Fort Breckenridge. A retired Joint Special Operations commander had entered the room unannounced. No rank insignia, just that coin placed flat on the table. Every person in uniform, including her superior, had stood to attention without hesitation. No one said a word. No one had to. The coin had said enough. Now she'd seen it again, in the hands of a man whose name had rung dimly in her memory, Martin G. Blake. And when the manager had dismissed him like a con artist, something in her had snapped back into place. Not instinct. Training. Recognition. She stepped closer to the counter and didn't blink when Ethan, the smug manager, turned toward her. "You just made a mistake," she said flatly. Ethan scoffed, but there was something behind his eyes, a flicker of doubt he hadn't fully buried. "If he's so important," he said, voice coated in sarcasm, "why is he alone?" Kira didn't answer. She turned and walked toward the glass door, pressing her phone to her ear. Her fingers moved quickly. The tone rang once, twice, and then connected. "It's me," she said. "We've got someone at Maple Dominion. I just saw a Bishop coin. Name, Martin G. Blake." The silence on the other end was brief but thick. Then a voice, calm, measured, experienced, spoke 3 words, "Don't let him leave." Inside, the stillness had changed texture. The tension was no longer just awkward. It was brittle. Something unspoken had passed between the guests and the staff, as if all could sense that what just happened should not have. But no one dared say it aloud. Except one. In the rear office, tucked behind the customer service corridor, Stanley Keller adjusted his glasses. He was a quiet man. 59. Kept to himself. Never missed a shift in 22 years. The kind of employee most managers forgot was there, even though he kept the place running better than anyone realized. But Keller remembered names. He remembered when this bank opened. He remembered the brass plaque mounted in the hallway near the archive room. He remembered that name, Martin G. Blake. Not just from a file. From history. He left his desk without a word, stepped into the archival hallway, and looked at the plaque again. Mounted there in gleaming metal, beneath the dedication to the original base command of the Royal Joint Forces, was the name Colonel M.G. Blake, Strategic Coordinator. The very same man who had designed the transport infrastructure before this site was ever converted to a bank. Keller didn't waste time. He walked to the old rotary line, one reserved only for internal military liaison contact, a relic that had never been decommissioned because no one ever asked to. He dialed 7 digits. The voice that answered didn't identify itself. Keller only spoke 6 words. "Bishop coin. Maple Dominion. He's here." Then he hung up and waited. Back on the floor, Martin still hadn't moved. Neither had the coin. Kira re-entered the building and stood across the lobby from him. Ethan watched her carefully now, something unsettled in his expression. A few customers had quietly left. Others stayed, feigning distraction while glancing too often toward the old man by the window. Miles away, across town in a restricted access command facility, a call was transferred directly to General Douglas Rourke's assistant. The aide listened, said nothing, and then opened the door to the general's office. Inside, Rourke stood reviewing a classified dossier. A man of few words and less patience. He raised an eyebrow as the aide approached. "You've got a ping," the aide said, voice hushed. Name came through the emergency vet line. Rourke frowned. "Who?" The aide simply answered, "Martin Blake." There was no confusion. No further clarification needed. Rourke slammed his hand against the desk, hard enough to shake the coffee cup off its coaster. He stood up, jaw clenched. "Get my uniform." Blake was more than a name in Rourke's memory. He was the architect of joint force coordination. He was a ghost, a myth, the man whose tactics had once saved a whole company pinned down in lowland jungle when all communications had failed. The man who had vanished from active service over 2 decades ago, without ceremony or promotion. The idea that someone had called him a fraud, in public, in uniform, wasn't just offensive. It was intolerable. Rourke's aide moved quickly, grabbing the pressed ceremonial uniform, the one the general had worn only twice in the last 10 years. Medals, stars, all precision placed. Rourke didn't say another word. He didn't have to. His steps were already carrying him out the door, and back at the bank, the clock ticked down to the moment none of them would forget. Ethan Carver paced now. His confident smirk had faded. The young teller no longer giggled. The security guard stood still, arms at his sides, watching Martin Blake like a man unsure whether he was witnessing something about to explode or something about to be remembered forever. And Kira Thompson stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the front doors, waiting for the sound she knew would come, the sound of real boots on polished tile, approaching like memory made flesh. Martin Blake hadn't moved. Not since he was asked to sit by the window, not since they dismissed his coin, not since the laughter faded. He sat with his hands resting over the curved top of his cane, his shoulders straight despite the ache in them, his eyes locked on something far beyond the glass, far beyond the flag flapping gently in the wind outside. It wasn't the flag he saw. It wasn't even the street. It was something quieter, deeper, something that lived in the spaces behind memory. He thought of his grandson. The boy had just been accepted to a university up north, first in the family to get in. Tuition was high, too high, and Martin had promised he'd help, even if it meant returning to a place he thought he'd never need again. This bank, that account, the one they told him didn't look real, the one they called suspicious, the one he used to send hazard pay home from foreign soil decades ago, the same soil where other men didn't make it back. The account hadn't changed. He had. The room had. The world had. But all he needed was a withdrawal and a receipt. That was all. No thanks. No salute. No spotlight. Just enough for a promise to be kept. Inside the bank, the atmosphere shifted. The stillness wasn't calm anymore. It was tight, strained. Employees behind the counter moved slower. A few glanced toward Martin and looked away just as quickly. Some whispered. One teller excused herself to the back room. Ethan Carver, the manager, tried to act indifferent, but the way he kept checking the front door, the way his fingers tapped the countertop in uneven patterns, betrayed him. He didn't know why, but something felt off now. The smug confidence he'd had earlier, the mockery, the laugh, that was fading. And he didn't understand why. Across the room, Kira stood still, her arms crossed. She didn't need to explain to anyone why she hadn't left. She was trained to spot tension before it spoke. This wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was anticipation. She pulled out her phone again and called a friend from her old unit. A reliable one. "Need a favor," she said. "Name's Martin Blake. Ever heard of him?" There was a pause, then a shift in tone on the other end. "Colonel Blake?" the voice asked. "You're telling me he's alive and sitting in a bank?" Kira's silence was the only answer needed. "Don't let him leave," the voice said firmly. "He's not just some vet. He's legacy. He wrote the rules half of us still follow." Kira hung up, her eyes never leaving Martin. And still, he waited. He didn't check his watch. He didn't look impatient. He didn't even seem to notice the building growing quieter around him. Customers had begun filtering out. A woman in line stepped away, muttering that she'd come back later. A man near the coffee station abandoned his cup and slipped out the side door. The security guard now stood near the front window, his posture more alert than before, not because of any threat, but because he sensed something important was happening and wasn't sure if he should step in or step aside. Martin didn't care about any of it. He didn't need their approval. He didn't want it. He had been overlooked before. It no longer surprised him. The world had changed. He'd accepted that. But what he wouldn't accept was breaking a promise to the kid who had trusted him. That thought anchored him there more than any command ever had. His grip on the cane tightened slightly as the pain in his shoulder flared. Old wound. Years ago, a silent reminder of a hill no one talked about anymore. He could still feel the weight of the gear, the sting of the rain, the blast that knocked him sideways and left him coughing blood behind enemy lines. They had carried him out, half dead, and when he woke up, all he asked was whether the supply line had held. It had. That was enough. It always had been. Now, inside a quiet bank in a city that barely remembered his name, he waited. Because that's what men like him do. Not with demands. Not with threats. But with silence and patience and the kind of discipline that younger generations mistake for submission. He wasn't weak. He was trained. He wasn't forgotten. He was just not looking to be seen. But some things, some names, refused to stay buried. Kira took a slow breath, glanced down at her phone, and noticed 3 missed calls from her contact. She ignored them. She already knew what they meant. Reinforcements were coming. Or at least attention. And still, none of the staff understood why the air felt heavier, why the fluorescent lights seemed louder, why even the printers had gone quiet. Ethan checked his watch again. Still nothing. He turned toward one of the junior tellers and whispered, "What is he waiting for?" The girl didn't answer. No one had the answer. But they all felt it. Like a pressure system just outside the walls. Like thunder on the edge of hearing. And then, outside, the sound of tires turning sharply on pavement. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. It didn't screech. It didn't announce itself. But it didn't need to. Because something had just changed. And everyone inside knew, even if they didn't know why yet. The man by the window didn't look. He just blinked once and exhaled slowly. Not relief. Just preparation. Like a soldier hearing boots in the dirt again. Like a man who knew the difference between being called and being needed. The moment the glass doors opened, no one made a sound. It wasn't the usual entrance of a customer or a casual visitor. This wasn't someone looking for a deposit slip or checking on interest rates. It was something else. Something that demanded silence without asking for it. The sound of polished boots striking tile echoed like a heartbeat. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Just deliberate. A presence, not a performance. General Douglas M. Rourke entered the bank in full dress uniform. His coat was sharp, his medals flawless, every crease pressed into place with the kind of precision that spoke of discipline, not vanity. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. He didn't acknowledge anyone in the room. His eyes locked straight ahead on the man sitting by the window. The man no one had spoken to in over an hour. The man they'd dismissed. The man they'd mocked. Colonel Martin G. Blake. Every pair of eyes followed Rourke's steps, but no one dared move. Ethan Carver, who had been pacing minutes earlier, froze mid-breath. The tellers stopped typing. Even the guard nearest the entrance instinctively stood straighter. General Rourke walked until he stood directly in front of Blake. And then, in full view of the entire lobby, he stopped, planted his boots, squared his shoulders, and gave a salute so sharp and precise it cut the air in half. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't for show. It was respect. Earned, not given. The room didn't breathe. Blake looked up. There was no recognition in his eyes at first, just surprise. A flicker of memory. Then a slow, steady understanding. He rose from the bench, slowly, deliberately, and returned the salute. His hand didn't tremble. His posture didn't falter. And for the first time that morning, silence in the bank felt justified, not awkward. It was reverence, not guilt. Rourke lowered his hand, turned, and faced the room. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was low, measured, exact. Who here called Colonel Blake a fraud? The words struck the room like a gavel. Nobody spoke. Not the tellers. Not the manager. Not the guard. Not a single customer. The silence was immediate and absolute. Rourke took a single step forward. Colonel Martin G. Blake, he said clearly, was instrumental in the creation of the Joint Tactical Recognition System still used by 3 allied nations today. He served in 2 major wars. He led 14 operations that remain unrecorded in your textbooks because the details are still classified. He was wounded twice, decorated 4 times, and nearly lost in a mission that, to this day, has no name, only a success rate attached to it because of him. His eyes swept the room. and someone here decided his paperwork looked too old. A breath caught somewhere in the lobby. Eyes turned, slowly, unwillingly, toward Ethan. His skin had drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed. I didn't know, he said, voice thin. The discharge forms. Of course they're old. Rourke snapped, his tone still controlled but like steel drawn from a sheath. He earned his age. He fought for this country while your biggest challenge was learning how to program a tweet. The shift in the room was instant. From discomfort to shame. The same people who had chuckled behind their phones now looked at them like they were weapons. Kira stood still, arms crossed, face unreadable. She'd known something was coming. But not this. Not like this. Rourke gave one last glance around the room, then stepped back toward Blake. His voice dropped, softer now, not for them, but for the man who hadn't asked for any of this. I'm sorry I didn't know you were here, Colonel, he said. I should have been the one to meet you. Blake didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded once. I didn't come to be seen, he said quietly. Just needed a little help for my grandson's school. Rourke's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't blink. Then we'll see to it. He turned, signaled his aide forward. The aide opened a briefcase and placed a thick folder on the counter, along with a single velvet-lined case and a printed plaque, identical to the one mounted in the archive hall. Rourke addressed the staff directly. This bank was built on land secured by operations Colonel Blake led. The account you marked as suspicious helped fund original supply routes to the command center that preceded this building. The man you tried to remove is the reason this place exists. Nobody responded. They didn't have to. Rourke turned back to Blake. Sir, if you'll come with me, we'll complete your transaction. And we'll do it properly. Ethan stepped backward instinctively, the smugness fully drained from his expression. Blake walked beside Rourke toward the teller window, the same one that had denied him earlier. This time, no one laughed. This time, no one doubted. This time, no one dared look away. Behind the counter, the young teller's hands shook as she printed the withdrawal slip. She handed it to Blake, whispering an apology he didn't acknowledge. Not out of bitterness, but because he didn't need it. He folded the paper carefully, tucked it into his coat, and stood in silence. But Rourke wasn't finished. He placed a hand on Blake's shoulder. Colonel, he said, do you have 5 minutes? Blake raised an eyebrow. For what? Rourke didn't answer with words. He turned to the room. No command spoken, no gesture made. But every veteran in the building, 2 in line, one filling a deposit form, one sitting in the corner, stood up. They raised their right hands in salute. And slowly, quietly, so did the civilians. Not because they were told, but because something inside them knew this was right. Blake stood still for a second, then returned the salute with precise, practiced movement. Rourke reached into his coat and handed him the velvet case. We've kept this a long time, he said. It's yours now. Inside was a medal. Polished, simple, inscribed with 3 words, service beyond record. Blake looked at it, not with emotion, but with the quiet understanding of a man who had waited too long to be remembered but never asked to be. He nodded once. I didn't come here to be honored, he said. I came to keep a promise. Rourke nodded. And in doing so, you reminded us all what that really means. No one clapped. No one spoke. But everyone stood taller. And somewhere beyond the lobby doors, the noise of the city kept moving. But inside the Maple Dominion Bank, time had stopped. Respect doesn't require volume. Sometimes it only needs one man. And one moment. General Rourke didn't rush. With practiced hands, he opened the leather briefcase carried by his aide and removed 3 items. A thick classified folder, a small velvet case, and a framed brass plaque. He placed them carefully on the counter, not like objects but like pieces of something sacred. The folder held documents sealed with the Joint Strategic Command crest, details of operations, commendations, citations, some still blacked out. The case contained a rare medal issued by special directive, awarded not for service on record, but for service that existed in the margins, in places where cameras never went and histories were written only in memory. And the plaque bore one simple inscription under the engraved name of Colonel Martin G. Blake. Honor in silence. Rourke didn't explain them. He didn't need to. Every person watching now understood they were standing in the presence of something they had almost erased. Turning toward Martin, Rourke took out a folded check, handwritten, signed with authorization codes. This will cover your grandson's tuition, he said simply. And then some. Martin looked at the paper for a long second, not because of the amount, but because someone had finally remembered. He took it, folded it once, and placed it in his inside coat pocket like it was just another piece of business, no different than the receipt he'd hoped to leave with an hour ago. The teller behind the counter, young, pale, eyes still wide, lowered her head as she placed his transaction slip on the desk. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, barely audible. Martin didn't acknowledge her, not out of resentment, simply because he hadn't come for apologies. He never asked for them, and he didn't need them now. He nodded once, a gesture so minimal it was nearly invisible, then turned and began to walk toward the exit, slow and steady, exactly as he had entered. But Rourke stepped forward. "Colonel," he said firmly, stopping him. "Before you go." Martin paused. No one else moved. The general turned to the room and didn't raise his voice. He didn't give an order. He simply stood straight, hands at his sides. And still, without a word spoken, every veteran in the bank rose from where they stood. One by one. A retired Navy medic who had been quietly filling out a deposit slip. A reservist in civilian clothes near the ATM. A logistics officer picking up a statement. Even civilians, unsure why, stood up and followed their lead. And then, as if it had always been rehearsed, they all lifted their right hands in a salute. Not because of rank, not because of orders, but because something inside them told them this was a man who deserved it. The silence in that room wasn't awkward now. It was sacred. No applause, no speeches, just a row of upright figures, faces solemn, eyes focused on the man who had almost been ushered out like a nuisance. Martin Blake stood still for a moment, unmoved, as if testing the moment for sincerity. Then slowly, his hand rose in return, not with ceremony, but with precision, years of muscle memory activating as if no time had passed. It was the same motion he'd done in desert winds, jungle rain, freezing mornings before deployment. He completed the salute, held it, and then dropped it cleanly. Rourke stepped beside him and handed him the velvet case. "We've kept this longer than we should have," he said. "But it's yours." Martin opened it just enough to glimpse the metal inside. He didn't speak, didn't cry. He nodded once, not as a thank you, but as a confirmation. This, too, was part of the promise. And then he closed the case, slipped it into his coat pocket, and turned again toward the door. The people in the room parted without needing to be told. And as he walked past them, quiet, calm, invisible once more, each head turned to watch him go. He didn't say a word. No cameras followed him. No headlines would appear in the morning. But the bank that had almost erased him had become, in that hour, something else entirely. A place of reckoning. A place of remembering. The brass plaque with his name would be mounted on the lobby wall that week, beneath the original dedication from decades ago. No one would ask about it. No one would question the addition. But everyone who worked there, everyone who saw it, would know. Because some men do not need applause. They only need 5 minutes. And one person who remembers what they stood for. Martin didn't linger. He didn't pose with the medal. He didn't turn for applause or offer a closing word. He held the velvet case for a moment, nodded once, not to Rourke, not to the room, but perhaps to something older, deeper, and then walked quietly toward the exit. No music played. No reporter chased after him. No phones were lifted to record. And yet, no one took their eyes off him. He didn't demand space, but space was made for him. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. He stepped into the daylight as he had stepped into the bank, alone, steady, with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who never rushed, but always arrived exactly when needed. Outside, the sidewalk was just another stretch of pavement. No parade. No media vans. Just wind and quiet, and a man heading home after keeping his word. The bank doors closed behind him, but no one inside moved for a long while. Later that week, without announcement or ceremony, a new brass plaque was affixed to the wall near the lobby entrance. The same wall where the original military dedication had hung for decades. The new plaque bore no date, no account of what happened that day, no mention of General Rourke, no apology from the manager, and no quote from the press. Just a name, Colonel Martin G. Blake. And below it, a single line. Honor in silence. No one explained it. No one needed to. But customers began to notice. Tellers walked a little differently past that section of the wall. Veterans who came in for routine banking sometimes paused, nodded at the plaque, and then kept moving. No one asked them to. No one told them to. But they did. Some things don't require speeches. Some stories don't need to be repeated to be remembered. There were no more jokes about paperwork. No more assumptions made based on age or uniform. And if anyone asked about the coin or the man or the general who had once walked through those doors in full dress and changed the air in the room, the answer was simple. Some truths don't shout. They don't need to. Martin never returned to that branch. He had no reason to. The transaction was complete. The promise fulfilled. The medal, engraved with service beyond record, remained in his possession, tucked away in a drawer he rarely opened. His grandson started college that fall, never knowing the full story, only that his grandfather had made something happen that no one else could. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it always had been. The lobby returned to its usual rhythm, but something about it had shifted permanently. Because once a room has borne witness to something real, it never fully forgets. And once people have seen what dignity looks like without noise, without anger, without revenge, just presence, they carry it with them. Not as guilt, but as a quiet standard. No headlines ever captured what happened that day. No viral clip ever surfaced. But the story spread the way stories should, person to person, moment to moment. And in the end, all that was left was a man, a coin, and a name on a wall that told the truth in 6 simple words. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They change the entire room just by being there. And so, the story of Colonel Martin G. Blake did not end in applause or headlines. It ended the way he had lived, with purpose, humility, and a quiet strength that left a deeper mark than any ceremony ever could. He didn't return for recognition. He didn't ask to be believed. He came to fulfill a promise. And in doing so, he reminded everyone in that room, and now everyone who hears this story, that honor isn't always loud. Sometimes, it walks in alone, sits in silence, and changes everything without saying a word. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on the quiet heroes around us, the veterans, the parents, the everyday people who sacrifice without asking for credit, don't let their stories go unheard. Leave a comment below and tell us, who is the quiet hero in your life? Who is the person that changed everything without needing the spotlight? Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that dignity doesn't shout, it simply stands tall. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories of truth, humility, and unspoken honor, then make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another moment like this. Because some stories don't just deserve to be told, they deserve to be remembered.